when we talk about Islam in America, we can actually speak about three big periods. This would be one of them. And then you have post-1965. Do any of you know why 1965 would be a cutoff? What is it that happened in 1965? And in order to answer that question, you probably have to know more about American history than you may know. But in 1965, three important things happened. One of them was that African Americans, blacks, were allowed to vote, and a lot of civil rights legislation was passed that had the purpose of breaking down segregation in American society. American society was a segregated society. And in that regard, it was not radically different from South Africa. So in 1965, that begins to change. And in that year also, the United States government changed its policy on immigration. Before that time, people who came from the Muslim world were coming to the United States, but only from certain countries, and their numbers were very limited. There was a quota system. Quota system means only a certain number are allowed to come. And most of the people who came to the United States came from Europe. And Northern Europe was preferred. And Southern Europe was allowed. And Eastern Europe was allowed, but not preferred. After 1965, that changes. And therefore, after 1965, we have a very large immigration to the United States of people from the Middle East, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other parts of the world. Many of these are Muslims, although most of them were not, but many of them were Muslims. So this will fundamentally change the history of Islam in the United States. After 1965, it's very different than it was before that time. Another event that happens in 1965 is the assassination of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is a very important figure. And his assassination will also be important for the development of Islam in the United States, because many people, white, black, Hispanic, they are affected by Malcolm X. I was one of those people. So these are three events. And then you have another period which is before this time and before Coloumbus. And I'm not going to talk about that. I have another presentation about that, and I take that period very seriously. Interestingly, when the Spanish and the Portuguese came to the Americas in the 1500s, they believed that they encountered Muslims everywhere they went. When Cortés, the Spanish conqueror, conquers Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, he says that we found in this city many beautiful mosques, mezquitas bonitas, and teocallis. Teocallis are indigenous temples. So he distinguishes between mosques and teocallis, and many beautiful houses. So how could that be? Is it possible? Most historians say this is absurd. And there were no Muslims in America before Columbus. How could there have been? But actually, when we look at that more closely, we see that it is a possibility, and I would say it is a probability. It's probably true. But we won't tell that story. I wish that we had time to tell it. But what we want to do then is to look at that middle period, which is 1585 to 1965. And this begins actually with the first English colony in America. And this is the colony of Roanoke, which was established in 1585, and it lasted until 1590. This colony was established by Sir Walter Raleigh, whose picture you see here on the right. And Sir Francis Drake was very important also in the beginning of the colony. This colony was a privateering colony. In American history, we are told about the mysterious colony of Roanoke, that it came and it went. And as if we don't know anything about it. Actually, we know very much about it. There's nothing mysterious about Roanoke. It was a privateering colony. What does privateering mean? What is a privateer? How do you say that in German? Privatier. What is a privateer? A privateer, do you want to say? Well, privateers are respectable pirates. A pirate is his own boss, his own captain. A pirate is an outlaw completely. A privateer always works under the banner of a state. So privateers always belong to a political power. But the privateer will not necessarily say that. So for example, at the end of the 16th century, Spain is very powerful. And Spain and Portugal at that time are united. So they are a very powerful force in the world. And they control all of the New World. Technically, North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America are all, technically speaking, the right of Spain and the right of Portugal to develop. And in the Americas, you have much gold and silver. This is very important. This is one of the reasons why Muslims in West Africa were almost certainly interested in the Americas, because there was gold there, and they were the major source of gold in the world. And where did they get that? Well, they got it from West Africa, but many historians say there's not enough gold in West Africa to account for the amounts of gold that they had. But the Spanish are getting much gold from America and silver. And the privateers want to take that gold away from them to enrich themselves, but also to undercut Spanish power. So Queen Elizabeth appoints many privateers who were English, Scottish, Welsh, and they will attack the Spanish ships. But attacking the Spanish ships is very difficult if you have to come from Europe. So in 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh establishes the colony of Roanoke in North Carolina. And it's a colony that can have its own ships and attack the Spanish to the south in the Caribbean. This is very important. When Sir Walter Raleigh comes to Roanoke in 1586, he attacks Spain on the way there, and then he comes into the Caribbean, and he has a number of attacks. But finally he comes to what is today Colombia, to the city of Cartagena, the port of Cartagena, and there he liberates a number of galley slaves. These are galleys that row the boats. And 200 of those were identified as Muslims. They're called Turks, which could mean Ottomans. A lot of these Turks were actually Greek-speaking, and Moors. And he brings them to Roanoke. He brings them to the Roanoke colony. So this is very, very interesting. So we see that when this history of English colonization in the New World begins, Muslims are part of the story. Again, maybe they're not a very important part of the story, but it is important to say that. In fact, these Turks will be, many of them, returned to Istanbul. And this is very, very important because the British at that time are developing very strong ties with Istanbul and also with North Africa. What happened to these 200 galley slaves? We know that a lot of them were taken home. They're taken back to England, and in the case of the Turks, they are returned, or at least a lot of them are returned to Istanbul. But did they all go back? And here, and I wrote this article here, Turks, Moors, and Moriscos in Early America. So this is about this story. And if you were interested in this, you can look at it. Now, one of the interesting things is that in America, we have two peoples who regard themselves to go back to Roanoke. One of these is a people called the Melungeons. And the other one is a people called the Lumbees. I haven't talked here about the Lumbees. But the Melungeons are a people who were in America before the English came, before the Scots and the Scots-Irish and the English came. And they did speak English. They are not Indians. They're not First Nations. And they look Mediterranean as a rule. And these are people who say that they have their roots in Roanoke. So this is very interesting. And if they do have their roots in Roanoke, then it's quite possible that they might go back to those Muslims who were brought there. In fact, the Melungeons, when they speak of themselves, they would call themselves sometimes Moors. And sometimes they call themselves Portuguese. And they were apparently called Mecca Indians. When I wrote this article, the fact that they were called Mecca Indians is the thing that made me want to write the article. Unfortunately, when I went back to the primary sources, I couldn't find the reference. So therefore, I had to change a lot of what I said. But they believe that they were called Mecca Indians. In other words, they're called Indians, although they're not, but it is said that they would bow towards Mecca. And these are pictures of the Melungeons. They're mostly in the South, in North Carolina and Tennessee. This is a man who has Melungeon roots, Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, a woman from the United States is working on the DNA of Lincoln, and she found my article and she contacted me because she said that they found that Lincoln's DNA is unique, especially that of his mother. And his mother is the Melungeon, Nancy Hanks. Hanks is a Melungeon name. Here's another man with Melungeon roots, Clark Gable. And Nancy Hanks was a Melungeon, and Tom Hanks is too. What do these Americans have in common? Well, they're not Melungeons. Humphrey Bogart, Jacqueline Kennedy, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Eli Whitney. And we can add to that, and these are very important people. These are people that are important in American history. And here is Anderson Cooper, whom you may know from television, and his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt. So all of these people, they have something in common. They're not Melungeons, but they have, without any question, a common ancestor, and this is him. Jan Jansson van Haarlem, who was called Murad Rais, who lived from 1570 to 1641. Murad Rais, Jan Jansson, was a famous Dutch privateer. He then became a Muslim corsair. And when that happens, these people are called in the West renegades. The word renegade, renegado, comes into the English language to refer to a European who becomes a Muslim. Literally, the word renegade means apostate, to renege. They reneged on their religion. So he becomes a renegade corsair. And corsairs, by the way, who are called Barbary pirates, usually, they actually are also privateers. They worked under the regencies of North Africa, and later these renegades will be under the French and the British, by the way. And this was a relatively common occurrence in the 16th and 17th centuries. You had many renegades by the thousands. Murad Rais was the first president and Grand Admiral of the Corsair Republic of Saleh in Morocco, which is next to Ar-Ribat. Both his life and that of his son, Anthony, overlapped with the 80 Years' War of Dutch independence from 1568 to 1648 against the powerful empire of United Spain and Portugal. So their whole lives are very much tied to the battle against Spain and the battle for Dutch independence. And Murad Rais was a very powerful figure, very wealthy figure. This is a painting of him. I don't know how historically accurate it is. But he had a son that I don't have any picture of. By the way, before we get there, these are two books that you should be aware of. Can you read them? I don't know if that's very clear. Turks, Moors, and Englishmen. I based my article on that title. In the Age of Discovery. And this is by Nabil Matar. This is an academic work. It is on the English renegades and the Scottish renegades. And he has lots of information, very, very interesting information. The picture here of this very suspicious-looking renegade is one of the renegades of that time. And then you have the other book here, Les Chrétiens d'Allah, the Christians of Allah. And this is by Bartholomé Ben Nassar and his wife Lucille. This book is also very important because of the fact that it is much broader than Matar. Matar is looking just at the phenomenon of the renegades from the standpoint of England, Scotland, and Wales, which is very important. But Ben Nassar, who is French, he looks at this phenomenon in much more general terms because he relied on the records of the Inquisition in the Mediterranean. And in his book, you will see that the renegades, according to the testimony of Benedictine monks, were from every land in Europe, even Russia, Poland, Scandinavia, and they were very numerous. Many of them were corsairs, and this is what they were preferred for, because they knew how to fight modern warfare at sea. Muslims knew how to fight at sea, but they didn't necessarily know modern warfare. So the Corsairs would know that. And they were also soldiers in some cases, but in many cases they were tailors, they were carpenters, they did other things, and they did not always convert to Islam. Many of these people who went to the Muslim world remained Christian, but they found that life in the Muslim world was favorable to them. This is very important. In fact, when the Americas, North America, is being settled by the English in the 17th century, in the 1600s, there are many more Englishmen and Scots and Welsh who are either renegades or who are living in North Africa or in Syria or other countries than there are in the population of the colonial United States. So this is an important part of history. And these people were very important in the history of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and the Ottoman Empire as well. So Anthony Fansali, this is the descendant of Murad Rais. He lived from 1607 to 1676. He is one of Murad Rais's 5 sons. His mother, Margarita, is referred to as a Moorish woman. We don't know what that means. Anthony was extremely tall and strong, and he was dark. He was one of the original settlers of New Amsterdam, which is Dutch New York City. He was a prominent landlord, merchant, and creditor there, and one of the first Muslims in colonial America. When I worked on the web book, which we'll talk about a little bit, I have it with me. Mashallah, we did I didn't just do it. I had a research team that helped me with this book. And a lot of the things that we found in it are new. No one had ever studied that before. But when I was working on this book, I found a report in an important source of American religious history that talked about corsairs being in the Hudson River in the 16th century. And to me, that rings true. But you can't put something in a book just because it rings true. But then we discovered this much later. I didn't know anything about this when I wrote this book. I knew nothing about it whatsoever. But this came to light just a few years ago. And so this would also tend to verify that other report, that the corsairs were there long before. In any case, this is one of the first Muslims that we know of in colonial America. He kept a personal copy of the Quran. He loved to recite it. He knew Arabic. He knew Dutch. His copy of the Quran was inherited by his family for many generations. So the Vanderbilt family, they know about this man. He settled in Manhattan, Dutch Manhattan, in 1630. He was 23 years old. By 1639, he was one of the largest landowners and most prosperous farmers on the island. His farm was near what is today Wall Street. Wall Street in those days was where the wall was that, was between the city and the outside. He had numerous legal disputes with the Dutch Reformed Church, which ran the colony. He was found guilty, for example, of housing an English Quaker. He was ultimately ordered to leave Dutch New York, but appealed to the Dutch West Indies Company, and they allowed him then to settle Brooklyn, which is, of course, across the water from Manhattan. And so he becomes one of the founders of Brooklyn, and Brooklyn was known in the beginning as Turk's Island. And then he becomes one of the largest and most prominent landowners in Long Island. Anthony was regarded as a passionate defender of racial minorities. He himself was racially mixed. One of his common civil offenses was pointing loaded pistols at slave drivers. Are you able to understand me? Yeah? Okay. Again, feel free to ask questions if you want to. Again, when we wrote this book, I knew nothing about this man at all. George Bethune English. And this is an American who embraced Islam decades before Webb. And this is the only picture that I could find of him. It's romantic. And George Bethune English is a very interesting figure. And he's one like Webb who is very historical, meaning that if we want to, we can study about him, and we should. Here you see the document from which we get the picture, a narrative of the expedition to Dangala and Sennar under the command of His Excellence Ismail Pasha, undertaken by order of His Highness Mehmet Ali Pasha, Viceroy of Egypt, by an American in the service of the Viceroy, George Bethune English. English, who lived from 1787 to 1828, was born and raised in Boston. He was a graduate of Harvard University. He was an American soldier and a diplomat. As a young man at Harvard, English entertained doubts about the origins of Christianity. This is something quite common at that time. And wrote a prize-winning thesis on the topic. Later, he published his ideas in book form, The Grounds of Christianity Examined. George Bethune English was close to the last generation of what Americans call the Founding Fathers. He was very close, for example, to James Madison. In 1815, James Madison appointed George Bethune English as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. In those days, the Marine Corps is the American military. There is no army. While sailing the Mediterranean, English visited Egypt, where he studied Islam and Arabic. After a period of contemplation, English converted to Islam and took the name Muhammad Effendi. And he learned Turkish. He spoke Turkish very, very well. In fact, he became so fluent in Ottoman Turkish that many Turks thought he was a native of the Ottoman Empire. Upon George Bethune English's return to the United States, President John Adams appointed English to the diplomatic corps of the United States in the Levant. The Levant is Syria and Lebanon, Palestine. And he sent him on a mission to Istanbul. English delivered a personal message from Adams to the Ottoman Sultan, saying that Muslims in America would be granted the same rights as Christians. So this is historical information, and this is very important. I would doubt that anyone needs to have that explained, but especially in the light of the things that are going on now, and the attempt of the alt-right, the right wing, to define Muslims in America and elsewhere as the other and as aliens, then this material is very important for us. Here we have a statement about Rhode Island. Roger Williams is the founder of Rhode Island, and Rhode Island was a colony established in order to have toleration for all religious faiths. That in the early colonies, they did not necessarily agree with that principle. When Roger Williams founded the Rhode Island colony, he expressed his hope that it would welcome even the Turks. And the word Turk here means Muslim. They would refer to Muslims as Turks. And others whose ways of worship were unconventional by Christian standards. Years before that, Williams shocked the Puritan sensibilities of Massachusetts Bay, by praising all who worshipped God freely, according to the dictates of their conscience, even if they were not Puritans. He said, I commend that man, whether Jew, Turk, or Papist. Papist here is a word for Catholic. It is a pejorative word. Or whoever that steers no otherwise than his conscience dares. And this is also very important because in that early period, before the American Republic and after the American Republic, you often find this sentiment that the colonies, and especially the United States, should be open to all people, whatever their religious background. Something that needs to be emphasized today. This is a book that came out last year, if I'm not mistaken, A History of Conversion to Islam in the United States, Volume 1. It's called White American Muslims Before 1975 by Patrick Bowen, published by Brill. And this is interesting. You can take note of it if this is interesting to you. But what Bowen has done is to show that the converts to Islam in that period before 1975 are hundreds and hundreds. And of course, he'll talk about Webb and he'll talk about other people. But he shows that actually there was a very significant number of Americans who were converting to Islam during this period. This is Alexander Russell Webb. You were given some readings from my book, and I would be very happy to discuss that with you after we finish the presentation, if you'd like to do that. Webb is a very interesting figure. He became a Muslim in 1888. He died in 1916. He is very typically American, and he is especially very typically a New Yorker from the state of New York. He has a lot of the cultural characteristics that New Yorkers were famous for. Individualism, religious heterodoxy. He can take whatever kind of religion he wants to take. And Webb became a very committed Muslim. I have no doubt about that. You can see it in his writings. He had great love of the Prophet. And it's interesting also that Webb, who started a mission for Islam in New York City in 1892, he was very well received by the American public. Remarkably well received. He had also people who didn't like him, especially the missionaries, and he didn't like the missionaries either. But Webb was not rejected by the American public at all. And his mission didn't last long. We talk about that in my book, why that was the case. But it wasn't because of the fact that he could not survive in the American environment. Webb, in fact, believed that Islam would be extremely positive for the United States. And he always speaks that way, that the social ideals of the American democracy, the pluralism that is supposed to be there, Islam would be the great facilitator for that. And his story is very interesting. Another thing that's very interesting about Webb is that his life is right in the middle of it all. If you look at American history as it develops in the 19th century and the early 20th century, most or many of the really important events that surround that, Webb was right there. And for that reason, one of my friends told me after we began to talk about Webb and the centrality of Webb in American history, that he is the Muslim Forrest Gump. He's always there. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because I felt that we owe it to Webb. He's an amazing figure. And he's very prominent in American life as well. but also because he is right there in the middle of the controversy over slavery, the Civil War. The Civil War is fundamentally essential to his formation. And then what happens after the Civil War, and then going west, the wars with Mexico. Texas was taken away from Mexico, and the general that led that is from Webb City, Hudson, New York. Native Americans, the blacks, and so forth. So in telling the story of Webb, we can also tell the story of the United States. And for Muslims in America, and I would say especially for those who come from immigrant backgrounds, it's very important for you to understand this country that you live in. It's very important for you to understand the background of these people, where they get their ideas, the kind of problems that they have faced. And so telling the Webb story enables us to do that, or to begin to do that. So here you have a picture of Webb in 1892. This is a picture of Webb that was taken when he went to India. And in this book, he had a very interesting trip to Rangoon and then to India. And he has a diary which I was able to find 2 volumes of. He has a 3-volume diary. Unfortunately, volume 3 was lost. I wish we could find it. It's really, really important. But I read volume 1 and volume 2, and he's very funny. Webb is extremely humorous. And I've given an account of that when he goes to India, his responses to the things that go on there and so forth. It's very funny. He's very humorous. Webb was also a very close friend of Mark Twain. And if you read the book, you'll see that Webb went to Missouri, which is where Mark Twain came from, and he was prominent in Missouri journalism. And journalism in the state of Missouri was the cutting edge of American journalism at that time. That might seem strange today, but that's the way it was then. And in Missouri, he worked for the same newspaper that Mark Twain had begun at. And so Mark Twain knew him, and he knew Mark Twain. And when he comes back to New York in 1892 to start his mission, he will invite Mark Twain and many others to come to a parlor talk that he has. Webb loved to give parlor talks. That's a very Victorian cultural convention, that you go to the parlor. Parlor means, of course, speaking room. There's a fireplace there. The women have a place to sit. The children have little chairs to sit on. The men have a place to sit. And you get up and you talk. And Webb loved to do this. He was giving parlor talks all the time. But one of the first parlor talks that he gave was in New York City. And Mark Twain was one of the people invited. And it's interesting because in 1894, Mark Twain writes a book called Tom Sawyer Abroad. And I know that all of you must have heard of Tom Sawyer, and you must have heard of Huck Finn. But Tom Sawyer Abroad is a later book. And in that book, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn and Jim, who is the African-American slave, they take off in an air balloon. And they go across the Atlantic and end up in Morocco, and they go across the Sahara Desert, and they go to Egypt and other countries. And when they come to Egypt, Tom points out that this is Egypt. How would he know that up in the balloon? And he said, this is the land of Moses. And so Jim says, then we have to come down because we have to honor Moses. This is his land. And Moses was a Presbyterian, and I am a Presbyterian, so we've got to come down and visit Egypt. And in this fictional story, they go around Cairo, and they come into some of the big mosques of Cairo. And Tom says that our little church in Hannibal, Missouri, inside this mosque would look like a pack of dry goods. It looked like a little box. And then they see these whirling dervishes I don't think you ever have whirling dervishes in Egypt, but in this book they do. And Huck gets dizzy looking at the dervishes. And then Tom says to Huck, "You know that they're all Muslims." And Huck responds, "What's a Muslim?" And Tom says, "A Muslim is a person who's not a Presbyterian." And then Huck says, "Then there's lots of them in Missouri." And I never knew that before. So this is very funny, and a lot of Americans know that story, but what they don't necessarily know is that most Americans reading that in 1894 would have thought about this man, who, although he hailed from New York, he was known as a Missouri journalist, and Twain knew him in Missouri. The last picture that we have here is of Webb towards the end of his life. This picture would have been around 1901, and he was appointed as the honorary Ottoman consul in New York City. So he was an official consul of the Ottoman Empire. He was then invited to go to Turkey, and he went there. He met Sultan Abdul Hamid, and he was given these two honors that you see here from the Ottoman Empire. One of them is the Order of Majidi, and the other one is a standard Ottoman honor. And so it's very interesting that he is the only American Muslim that we know of that was ever honored with that. And he was very close to the Turks. And the Turks also thought very highly of him, and they still do. In all the Muslim world, you'll find that the ones who tend to know about Webb will be the Turks. Here is another important American Muslim, T.B. Irving. He embraced Islam in the 20th century, and he died not too long ago. Now, here we have another legacy, and this one actually should be given prominence, and this is the legacy of the Africans who were brought to the Americas after the Spanish and the Portuguese began to colonize South and Central and North America. And hundreds of thousands of Africans were brought over to the Americans in the slave trade. And this is a very tragic period of human history, a very difficult period. It involves the ripping of these people out of their cultural homelands and then forcing them to come to a new land. And usually they divide them in their tribes also, so that they can't speak local languages. But this is a very important part of our history. It's an important part of United States history, but it's an important part of the history of every single country in America. And so the British and the French generally preferred West African Muslims. Most of the Africans who were brought to what is today the United States came from what we can call Senegambia, from that land which involves the Gambia and Senegal, which is around it. And in fact, even in American literature, when people wrote about the blacks in America in the 1800s and 1900s, they often referred to their homeland as Senegambia. And that's definitely where a lot of them came from. Some were brought from Mauritania, others were brought from Nigeria and other places. They preferred West African Muslim slaves because they were skilled at growing the crops they wanted to grow, sugar, hemp, and so forth. How many were the Muslims in the North American slave population? This we don't know for sure. Alan Austin, who wrote this book, African Muslims in Antebellum America, this is a pioneering study, very, very good pioneering study. He takes a conservative estimate that they were at least 10%, 1 out of every 10. Sylviane Diouf, who is from Senegal, and she teaches in the United States, and she has studied this also very closely. She says that the percentages may have been as much as 30%. That is about a third. So in any case, they were a significant number. A few years ago, I went to the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean, the island of Trinidad. And I went also to Guyana, which is in northern South America. And the reason why I took that trip is because of the fact that in Trinidad, in Guyana, and in some other islands, in South Africa, in Fiji, you have this phenomenon of what is called indentured servants. The indentured servant is sort of like a slave, except that he only has to be your slave for 5 years. And he can extend the period, maybe 10 years. And then he has to be paid. Usually he will be paid in land. In fact, many of the British who will go to the colonies, if they're poor, they will go as indentured servants. They will be essentially slaves for about 5 years, and then they get their freedom. So I wanted to look at the Muslims in those communities of Trinidad and Guyana because their roots are those of the indentured servants. And I wanted to compare them to the slaves. That how did they preserve their Islamic identity, and what can we deduce from that about the African slaves who were there before? And the indentured servants are actually brought there because in the 1830s, slavery was abolished. So you can't bring new slaves from West Africa. And how can you grow sugarcane if you don't have slaves? Slavery followed sugar like a parasite. Sugar is so labor-intensive at the time of harvest that you either have to pay the people a fortune to do the work, or they have to be slaves. Or, as is the case today, you have technology that can do that for you. But they didn't have that then. So when I was in Trinidad, I discovered something really interesting. And that is that in the War of 1812, the War of 1812 is a war in which Great Britain, the Crown, will try to take back the American colonies. So you have the revolution in 1776, but then the British, who never accepted that, in 1812, the time of Napoleon, they want to get back the colonies. This is the War of 1812. When the English come to America, they begin to enlist African slaves to fight in the English army. Because they don't want to be slaves, right? They're not happy with the system. So they tell them that if you fight for us, we will give you your freedom. But what happens if you lose the war? Because then the whites will retaliate. So the British made the promise that if we lose the war, we will resettle you in a safe place. And I didn't know anything about this. But when I went to Trinidad, I was told by a historian there that 3 battalions were settled, black battalions, were settled in Trinidad. And I went to visit the area where one of them was settled. And in fact, the blacks living there, at least the ones I met, they knew that these were their roots, that they were descendants of that battalion. I talked with them. I interviewed them. So there were 2 battalions that were Christian, and this was one of them, the one that I visited. But there was another battalion which was settled in the mountains of Trinidad, in what is called the Honda River Valley. And I wasn't able to go there. You have to have a guide to take you there. It's dangerous to go there by yourself because it's very thick forest and they have some types of snakes there that are very aggressive. So you have to have a guide that can take you in and bring you out. But I was told by this historian, who is a Hindu, that all the graves there faced the Qibla and that this was definitely a Muslim battalion. And that their captain, whose name was Abu Bakr, who was called Baker, he was also there with them. So it's very, very interesting. And one of the things that's interesting about it, although we have to be careful about making generalizations like this, is that you have 3 battalions that are settled in Trinidad. How many other battalions were there? I don't know. But if we assume that these 3 battalions are somehow demographically representative, then we could say that the Muslims constitute about 1/3, because they are one of the 3 battalions. And this is very interesting. So these 2 books, African Muslims in Antebellum America, Servants of Allah, they're very, very good. And these are academic studies. And I want to stress that because when we talk about this kind of history, it's very important for us not to be over-enthusiastic. It's very important for us not to get carried away and to keep things as academic and careful as we possibly can. In any case, this is also a very important part of the legacy of Islam in the Americas. The story that we know about, one of the earliest of these Muslims who was brought to America is Job, the son of Solomon, Ayub. He lived in Maryland around 1732. This is before the Revolutionary War. And a book was written about him called, here you have it, Some Memoirs of the Life of Job, the son of Solomon, the high priest of Bunda in Africa, who was a slave about 2 years in Maryland. He was then set free. He went back to England. He met the Queen and the royal family, and then he is repatriated to West Africa. But, this is very, very interesting. And he was a Fulani. He belonged to the Fulani tribe. He knew Arabic and knew the Quran. And in fact, he was liberated. That sometimes happened. And he was sent back to West Africa. This particular work, the Memoirs of Ayub ibn Sulaiman, is said to be the oldest instance or the first example of African American literature. It's not written by an African American. It's written by a white whose name is Thomas Blewett. He lived from 1690 until 1749. Blewett, according to the story, had been in West Africa. He had been enslaved, and the tribe of Job, and Job had been there, had set him free. So by strange coincidence, he apparently recognized Job, and he helped to get him set free and sent back to Africa. American literature has references to African American Muslim slaves. Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, the American classic, included references to the phenomenon of African American Muslim slaves in his novella, his little novel, Benito Sereno. Harriet Beecher Stowe, known for her famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was important in leading up to the Civil War, writes about an African American Muslim slave in the story Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. Both of these were published in 1856. George Washington Cable, a friend of Mark Twain, wrote of the presence of, quote, what he was pleased to call Arab Americans in Louisiana, who were not really Arabs, but they were West African Muslims who knew Arabic. Joel Chandler Harris, who wrote Uncle Remus, the Uncle Remus stories, he was also a friend of Twain, contended that some slaves were Arabs and not Africans. Again, probably confusing the fact that they are Arabic-speaking, although according to Joel Chandler Harris, what he writes, some of them were actually Arabs, probably from Mauritania. This is another example of a Muslim in early America. He was known as Yarrow. He lived in Maryland in the late 1700s, and he belonged to the era of what we call the Founding Fathers. And this beautiful picture of him is a picture that was painted by Charles Willson Peale. And that's important to me because Peale also painted portraits of George Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of Thomas Jefferson, of John Adams, and others. So if you have the painter who paints the presidents also painting Yarrow Mahmoud, doesn't this indicate to you that Yarrow Mahmoud had significant status? He was well known in Washington, D.C. Yarrow earned his freedom from slavery and amassed a fortune in real estate. He would not conceal that he was a Muslim. Peale attested, who is the painter, he attested in 1819 that Yarrow Mahmoud claimed to be well over 100 years old at the end of his life, and Peale described him as honest, courageous, and serious, and well liked by everyone. And he added, he professes to be a Muhammadan, and he is often seen and heard in the streets singing praises to God and conversing with him. So this is another really interesting. Okay. All right. This is Peale, just for your information. He's the painter. These are paintings he did of Washington. Here you have Prince Ibrahim, also of that group. He came to Mississippi in the 1800s, and we have a movie in the United States, which was done by Michael Wolff, who is a Muslim, and it's called Prince Among Slaves, which is the story of this man. It's a very beautiful story, very beautiful. And we won't linger on that. I'm going to try to just go through these slides and finish, and then we'll open it up for you. Here's another figure like this, Tom Salih Bilali, who's from Georgia. These are some of his relatives. Umar bin Said, another figure who came from what is today Senegal. These are two black abolitionists, Martin Robinson Delaney and Henry Highland Garnett. These are powerful people, and they fought in the Union Army against the South, and they were Christians, but they were Christians who knew that they had Muslim ancestry. And they knew they had Mandinka ancestry in particular. And this is also very, very interesting. And very proud people. They did not feel themselves to be inferior to anyone. Alexander Haley, whom my wife and I, who's sitting back here, got to meet before he died. He wrote the book Roots. You probably know about that. Maybe you've seen the movie. But he helped to write the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then he wanted to trace his own roots. And he found out that he has Mandinka roots that go back to Kunta Kinte, who is a famous figure in West African legends, and that he has Mandinka roots like those before him. Now we come into a period, we'll just go through this really quickly. Is that okay? Or do you want me to stop? All right, I'll do whatever you say. But, one of the really interesting things is as the African Americans who, under slavery and the post-slavery period, are completely deprived of any ability to study their history or to retrace their roots, they then are brought largely out of the South because of World War I and World War II. Because World War I and then World War II, they required that the United States have labor that it could no longer get from immigration because of the war. And so then they have to bring blacks out of the South to the North. This is called the Great Migration. And this will form the black communities or ghettos of New York City, of Newark, New Jersey, of Detroit, of Chicago, Philadelphia, and other cities. And when the blacks come into the ghettos of the cities, they have more freedom than they had ever had before. They don't have freedom, but they have more than they ever had before. And one of the things they do is they want to rediscover themselves. And so then you have the development of what we have called proto-Islamic movements. And we call them proto because they are not, quote unquote, orthodox. Some of their teachings are going to be bizarre to us, but they are, from a historian standpoint, an attempt to find out that religion at a time when, by the way, it was very difficult to do that. Noble Drew Ali, who is pictured here, is one of the first, and he established what is called the Moorish Science Temple. Moorish science would be what? Islam. The Moorish Science Temple, and he was very successful. This is a copy of his newspaper, very well done, The Moorish Guide. He has huge impact on the black community in the cities. Then you get, in the 1930s, the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad was its leader. It's a complex story, and we won't go into it right now. This is his wife, Clara Muhammad, who was a dynamic, courageous person. And although the teachings of the Nation of Islam are strange, he taught that the white man is a devil and the black man is a god. Perhaps we can excuse that in the context of the racism that he lived in at that time. Probably at the end of his life, 1975, he may have become an Orthodox Muslim. Many of his sons did. There's no question about that. Then you have other people. This is Sheikh Dawood and his wife, Mother Khadija. They were Sunnis in the very conscious sense of being Sunni Muslims. He was a jazz musician, and he's very influential on the jazz musicians of that time. And the role of Islam among the jazz musicians is also part of this story, which we're not able to tell right here. And they were very effective, by the way, in their da'wah. And then we come to Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. This is the name that he took at the end of his life, who was, again, in my opinion, a dynamic figure, a truly dynamic figure. Then we have the earliest immigrants in the 1880s. Hai Jali, this is the earliest one we know about. Hai Jali, which means Haji Ali. So they called him Hai Jali. He was brought for the Camel Corps of the American Army in 1856, and he remained in the United States. This is a picture of Hai Jali and his wife from Tucson. And then we have, this is from the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. And here you have the celebration of the ice cream cone, because the ice cream cone, they say, was developed at the St. Louis World Fair of 1904. Who did that? Well, his name was Anas Hamawi. And he was called Ernest. They didn't usually use Arabic names, but he is the one who did that. And ice cream is important to Americans. Ice cream and apple pie, right? So your ice cream cone, a Muslim American is the one who developed that. And really, this is significant. This pertains to identity. And Ernest Hemingway went on to establish the Missouri Ice Cream Cone Company. And we had a lot of immigrants coming over from Syria and Lebanon. Here you have what is called the Mother Mosque of Iowa, established in 1922. It's still there today. And actually there were other mosques that were established before that, but they didn't continue to exist. And then we end with this, 1965. This is Fazlur Rahman Khan. He was a great architectural engineer. And these two buildings in Chicago, what we used to call the Sears Tower, what do they call it now? I don't remember, but it's not the Sears Tower anymore, but it's the tallest building in the United States and one of the tallest in the world. And it is a very special type of architecture. This is the Sears Tower, and this is the Hancock Center. And both of these were designed by him. So these are things that it's important to bring to light.